Can you please take me to the hospital? Please, it's time.
Sarah's voice broke as a sharp, searing pain tore through her abdomen. She clung to the rusted iron gate of the dilapidated suburban house, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Rain lashed down, soaking her thin maternity dress, but the cold was nothing compared to the desperation in her heart. She looked up at the man standing under the dry porch, the man she had called her husband for 3 years. He looked at her not with love, but with a cold, calculated indifference that froze the very marrow in her bones. Sarah had no idea that the man standing before her, dressed in a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans, was actually Mark Sterling, the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar shipping empire. To her, he was just Mark, the struggling freelance architect she had supported through his supposed darkest years. She had worked double shifts at the local diner, feet swelling and back aching just to pay their rent while he claimed to be finding himself. She had given him her savings, her trust, and her heart, never realizing that their entire marriage was a social experiment for him, a way to see if anyone would love him for who he was, rather than his bank account. But now, the experiment was over, and Mark had decided that the life of a commoner was far too tedious to continue, especially now that a child was involved. As Sarah doubled over again, another contraction hitting like a tidal wave, Mark didn't move. He didn't reach for his keys. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, he checked his watch, a piece of hardware that Sarah thought was a cheap knockoff, but was actually a prototype worth more than the house they lived in. He looked at her as if she were a messy complication he was finally ready to delete from his life. He had already signed the papers. His lawyers were waiting in the city. The private jet was fueled. His real life was calling, and Sarah was a bridge he was ready to burn while she was still standing on it. "Call an Uber, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I told you this morning, I'm leaving. We're done. I've left some cash on the kitchen counter for the month's rent. After that, you're on your own." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with shock and agony. She thought he was joking, some cruel, stress-induced prank, but the look in his eyes was lethal. There was no trace of the man who had whispered promises of a future together while they ate cheap noodles by candlelight. She reached out, her fingers trembling, trying to grab the hem of his jacket. "Mark, I'm in labor. Our daughter, she's coming now. Please, I can't walk to the main road. The pain is too much. Just drive me to the clinic, please." He stepped back, avoiding her touch as if she were contagious. He didn't care that the nearest clinic was 3 miles away, or that the storm was intensifying. In his mind, he had already paid his dues to this life. He had played the part of the poor husband long enough. He was bored of the smell of grease on her uniform and the way she worried about utility bills. He wanted his silk sheets, his boardrooms, and his power back. He watched her collapse to her knees in the mud, her cries muffled by the thunder. To the world, Mark Sterling was a visionary, a philanthropist, a genius. To the woman dying inside on his doorstep, he was a monster. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Mark said, pulling a sleek black suitcase from behind the door, a suitcase she had never seen before. "I've redirected the mail. Don't try to contact me. The man you think I am doesn't exist." He walked past her, his boots splashing mud onto her arm. He didn't look back as he climbed into a dark sedan that had pulled up to the curb. Not a taxi, but a high-end vehicle with tinted windows that Sarah was too delirious to recognize. As the car sped away, leaving her alone in the dark, Sarah felt a different kind of pain, a shattering of her soul that was far worse than the contractions. She was alone. She was penniless, and her baby was coming. She crawled toward the gravel path, her fingers digging into the dirt. Every inch felt like a mile. She had to survive, not for herself, but for the life kicking inside her. She screamed for help, but the wind swallowed her voice. The neighborhood was quiet. The houses set far apart, and the rain formed a gray curtain around her. She felt the warmth of blood mixing with the cold rain. Panic began to set in. Was this how it ended? On a muddy path, abandoned by the person she loved most. She thought of the nursery she had hand-painted with cheap watercolors, the tiny clothes she had bought from thrift stores, and a sudden, fierce spark of rage ignited in her chest. If Mark wanted to disappear, fine, but she would not let him take her future. Sarah dragged her body toward the edge of the road, each movement a testament to a mother's iron will. The rage simmering in her chest provided a strange, flickering heat against the freezing rain. She reached the curb just as a set of headlights cut through the darkness. It wasn't Mark returning. It was a local grocery delivery driver who had forgotten a crate. The man jumped out, horrified to see a woman in such a state. Within minutes, Sarah was in the back of a cramped van, surrounded by the scent of fresh bread and damp cardboard, heading toward the county hospital. The driver drove like a man possessed, sensing the urgency of the situation. Sarah gripped the edge of a plastic crate, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, silently vowing that if she survived this night, she would never be a victim again. At the hospital, the world became a blur of fluorescent lights, shouting voices and the sharp scent of antiseptic. The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, but their faces grew grim when they saw Sarah's condition. She was hemorrhaging, and the baby's heart rate was dropping. They didn't ask about the father. They didn't need to. They saw the mud on her skin and the absence of a ring on her finger, making their own assumptions. But Sarah didn't care about their pity. She only cared about the rhythmic thump-thump of the fetal monitor. When the doctor told her they needed to perform an emergency C-section, Sarah simply nodded. "Save my daughter," she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former self. "Just save her." As Sarah was wheeled into the operating room, 30 miles away, Mark Sterling was stepping out of a private elevator into a penthouse that overlooked the entire city. The transition was seamless. He stripped off the flannel shirt, a costume he had grown to loathe, and dropped it into a wastebasket. A servant appeared instantly, offering him a glass of vintage scotch. Mark took a long sip, feeling the burn settle his nerves. His lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Elias, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. Elias held a thick folder containing the finalization of Mark's sabbatical. There were no records linking Mark Sterling to the small house in the suburbs. The marriage certificate had been filed in a remote county under a pseudonym that was now legally dissolved. To the world, Mark had been on a secret high-stakes business negotiation in Europe for the last 3 years. "Is the woman taken care of?" Elias asked, his tone professional and cold. Mark swirled the ice in his glass. "She's been given enough to cover her immediate needs. She's resilient. She'll find another man to support her within a year. That's how people like her operate." Mark felt a slight twinge of something, perhaps guilt or perhaps just the remnants of a habit, but he suppressed it. He reminded himself that Sarah had loved a lie. She had loved the poor architect, not the billionaire titan of industry. In his mind, he owed her nothing because she didn't even know who he truly was. He was reclaiming his throne, and a queen from the gutters was not part of the coronation. Back at the hospital, the silence of the recovery room was broken by a thin, sharp cry. Sarah opened her eyes to see a nurse holding a bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. "She's a fighter, just like you," the nurse said, her voice softening. Sarah reached out, her arms trembling as she took her daughter for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and blue eyes that seemed to look right through the facade of the world. In that moment, the pain, the betrayal, and the fear vanished. Sarah looked at her daughter and felt a power she had never known. She named her hope. As she held the tiny infant, a hospital administrator walked in, looking uncomfortable. He held a clipboard and cleared his throat. "Ms. Sarah, I'm sorry to bring this up now, but we need to discuss the billing and the discharge plan. You listed no emergency contact, and the insurance information provided's, well, it's invalid. Sarah looked at the man, then down at the cash Mark had left on the counter, which she had stuffed into her pocket before the ambulance arrived. It wasn't nearly enough to cover a surgery. She realized then that Mark hadn't just left her. He had tried to bury her. He knew she had no one. He knew she had spent her life savings on his projects. He had left her in a hole so deep he expected her never to climb out. The administrator's eyes were full of a polite kind of cruelty, the kind that precedes an eviction. "I will pay every cent," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I just need a phone and a week." The administrator sighed, clearly not believing her. But Sarah wasn't the same woman who had begged at the gate. The betrayal had burned away the softness, leaving behind something tempered and sharp. She remembered a man who had come into the diner months ago. An elderly, well-dressed man who had dropped a business card and told her she had a mind for numbers after she helped him resolve a complex billing error on his company's tab. She had tucked that card into her wallet, thinking nothing of it. Now, it was her only lifeline. While Mark Sterling was being photographed for the cover of a major business magazine, reclaiming his status as the most eligible bachelor in the country, Sarah was making a phone call from a hospital bed. She didn't call a lawyer, and she didn't call the police. She called the man from the diner, Arthur Montgomery, the CEO of a rival tech firm, and the only person who had ever looked at her and seen a professional instead of a waitress. "Mr. Montgomery," she said when the line connected, "you told me to call if I ever wanted to change my life. I'm ready, but I don't want a job. I want an empire." Arthur Montgomery sat in his high-back leather chair, listening to the woman on the other end of the line. He remembered her clearly. The waitress with the sharp eyes and the ability to calculate a complex corporate tax adjustment on the back of a napkin while balancing a tray of coffee. He had seen many geniuses in his time, but Sarah had something else, a desperate, burning hunger for survival. He agreed to meet her the following day, sending a private car to the hospital, much to the shock of the hospital administrator, who had just been preparing the discharge papers for a charity case. Sarah stepped into the vehicle with hope cradled in her arms, leaving behind the mud-stained dress and the memory of the woman who had begged a billionaire for mercy. The meeting took place in a quiet, high-end medical suite, owned by the Montgomery family. Arthur looked at the pale woman before him, and then at the infant. He didn't ask about the father, and Sarah didn't offer the information. "I have a proposal for you, Sarah," Arthur said, sliding a laptop across the mahogany table. "My firm is struggling with a hostile takeover bid from the Sterling Group. They are aggressive, they are cold, and they are using shell companies to hide their tracks. My analysts are baffled. You told me you wanted an empire. Show me how to save mine, and I will give you the resources to build yours." Sarah stared at the screen. The name Sterling Group flashing in her mind like a warning light. It was the first time she had seen the name in a professional context, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. Mark wasn't just a freelancer. He was the head of the very monster trying to swallow the only person willing to help her. The irony was bitter, but it gave her a focus she had never felt before. She spent the next 72 hours in that suite, fueled by caffeine and the soft breathing of her daughter. She tore through the Sterling Group's public filings, their offshore accounts, and the messy trail of their recent acquisitions. She found the pattern Mark thought he had hidden, a sequence of undervalued assets being moved through a subsidiary called Aegis, the same name he had once mentioned in his sleep. She realized Mark wasn't just rich. He was playing a dangerous game of market manipulation that bordered on the illegal. By the end of the week, Sarah presented her findings to Arthur. She hadn't just found a defense. She had found a kill shot. "If you leak this to the federal regulators," she explained, pointing to a discrepancy in the Aegis filings, "the Sterling Group's stock will plummet. They'll be forced to halt the takeover to deal with the investigation." Arthur looked at her with newfound respect. "This is brilliant, Sarah, but why tell me to leak it? You could sell this information to the highest bidder." Sarah looked him in the eye, her gaze cold. "Because I don't want money, Mr. Montgomery. I want the Sterling Group weakened. I want them vulnerable, and I want a seat at your table." Arthur smiled, a slow, predatory grin. He saw in Sarah a protégé who could eventually surpass him. He offered her a position as a senior strategic analyst under a new identity. Sarah chose the name Sarah Vance. She needed a clean break from the past. She needed a name that Mark Sterling would never associate with the woman he had left in the rain. While the legal paperwork was being drawn up, Sarah watched the news. Mark was back in the spotlight, attending a charity gala for orphans, ironically enough. He looked radiant, his smile perfect for the cameras, oblivious to the fact that the woman he had discarded was currently holding the detonator to his professional life. As the news of the regulatory investigation into the Sterling Group broke, the market went into a frenzy. Mark's face shifted from triumphant to panicked on every financial news channel. He was seen leaving his headquarters, surrounded by a swarm of reporters, his usual composure cracking. Sarah watched the footage from her new apartment, a sleek, minimalist space provided by Arthur. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. She knew Mark. He was a cornered animal now, and a cornered animal with billions of dollars was still dangerous. He would fight back, and he would look for the source of the leak. Sarah spent her days in the Montgomery boardroom, and her nights holding hope. She was learning the language of power, the nuances of corporate warfare, and the art of the silent strike. She began to invest the generous salary Arthur paid her into her own side projects, small tech startups that Mark's company had overlooked. She was building a web, strand by strand, and Mark was the fly. She also hired a private investigator, not to find Mark. She knew exactly where he was, but to find out exactly how he had managed to erase their marriage. What she discovered was even more chilling than she had imagined. The investigator found that Mark had used a high-level fixer to scrub the records. Not only was the marriage certificate gone, but her medical records from their time together had been tampered with. It was as if Sarah hadn't existed for those 3 years. She was a ghost in the system. The realization that he had planned his exit so meticulously, perhaps even before they were married, hardened her heart into a diamond. He hadn't just fallen out of love. He had never loved her at all. She was a project, a curiosity, a footnote in his grand biography. But as she looked at the data on her screen, Sarah realized she was about to become the main character in his downfall. While the Sterling Group scrambled to contain the PR nightmare, Sarah moved with the silence of a shadow. Under her new identity as Sarah Vance, she became the talk of the Montgomery firm. She wasn't just a strategist, she was a predator. She had a psychological advantage that no other analyst possessed. She knew how Mark Sterling thought. She knew his arrogance was his greatest strength and his most fatal flaw. He believed he was the smartest person in any room, and because of that, he never looked for threats from below. He only looked at his rivals on the same level. He was looking at Arthur Montgomery, never suspecting that the real architect of his misery was a woman he thought he had left to die in the mud. Mark, meanwhile, was losing his grip. The federal investigation was hitting his Aegis subsidiary hard. He sat in his mahogany office, the air smelling of expensive leather and stale stress. "How did they find it, Elias?" he roared, slamming his fist onto the desk. "That data was encrypted through 3 different layers of shell companies. Montgomery isn't that smart. He's a dinosaur. He doesn't have the technical prowess to dig this deep." Elias, his lawyer, looked pale. "Our sources inside Montgomery's firm say he's hired a new consultant, a woman named Vance. No one knows where she came from. She has no digital footprint before 6 months ago. She's a ghost, Mark." Mark narrowed his eyes. The name Vance meant nothing to him. He paced the floor, his mind racing. He needed to neutralize this threat. He ordered a full background check on this Sarah Vance, but Sarah had been careful. Arthur Montgomery had used his own considerable resources to create a backstory for her that was ironclad. On paper, she was a brilliant graduate from a remote European university who had been working in private equity. There was nothing to link her to the waitress in the stained apron. Mark's frustration grew. He was used to buying his way out of problems, but you can't buy someone you can't find. As the months passed, Sarah's influence grew. She convinced Arthur to pivot their strategy. Instead of just defending against the Sterling Group, they would begin a vulture acquisition of Mark's smaller, more vulnerable suppliers. One by one, the companies that provided the lifeblood of the Sterling shipping empire began to switch allegiances. Sarah was cutting off Mark's oxygen. She did it with surgical precision, offering better terms and a more stable future. She was building a reputation as a fair but fierce leader, the complete opposite of Mark's cold, transactional nature. Despite her rising power, Sarah lived a quiet life. Every moment away from the office was spent with hope. The little girl was growing fast, her laughter the only thing that could melt the ice around Sarah's heart. Hope was the reason Sarah didn't just walk away with her new wealth. She wanted to ensure that no one could ever take anything from her daughter again. She wanted to build a world where Hope would never have to beg for help. But the pressure of her double life was beginning to show. Sometimes she would catch her reflection in the glass of a skyscraper and see the tired waitress looking back, her eyes full of ghosts. One evening, Arthur called Sarah into his office. He looked troubled. "Mark Sterling has requested a face-to-face meeting," Arthur said, leaning back in his chair. "He wants to discuss a truce. He knows we're the ones squeezing his supply lines. He's offering a massive settlement to stop the regulatory pressure." Sarah felt a jolt of electricity run through her. This was it. The moment the prey realizes it's in a trap and tries to negotiate with the hunter. "And what do you think, Arthur?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I think he's desperate," Arthur replied, "but he's also dangerous. He's invited us to a private dinner at his estate, the same estate he usually keeps hidden from the public. He wants to show off his power, to remind us who he is. I told him I wouldn't come without my lead strategist." Sarah turned to look out the window at the city lights. Going to his home was a risk. Even though she had changed, her hair was shorter, her clothes were designer, her posture was regal, there was always the chance he would recognize her. But the desire to see the look in his eyes when he realized who had defeated him was too strong to resist. "I'll go," Sarah said, "but on one condition. We don't take his deal. We go there to show him that the time for deals is over." Arthur nodded, admiring her courage. He had no idea that for Sarah, this wasn't business. It was a reckoning. She spent the next few days preparing, not with spreadsheets, but with a cold, focused anger. She chose an outfit that was a statement of war, a sharp midnight blue suit that cost more than her old house. She looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim. She saw a conqueror. She was ready to step back into Mark Sterling's world, not as a wife, but as his downfall. The night of the meeting arrived with a heavy atmospheric fog that clung to the windows of the armored town car. As Arthur and Sarah drove toward the Sterling estate, the infamous Glass Palace, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm. She reached into her clutch and touched a small, laminated photo of Hope. That was her anchor. The car wound up a private road lined with ancient oaks, eventually stopping before a sprawling structure of steel and glass. It was a monument to ego, a place built by a man who believed he was untouchable. Sarah stepped out, her heels clicking against the marble driveway, a sound like a ticking clock. "I prefer to think of myself as a gardener, Mr. Sterling," Sarah replied, her voice cool and resonant. "I'm simply pruning the dead wood from the market." Mark chuckled, though the sound didn't reach his eyes. He pulled out a chair for her, an act of chivalry that felt like an insult. They sat down to a dinner that cost more than Sarah's old annual salary. yet she barely touched the food. Mark spent the first hour trying to charm them, speaking of synergy and mutual growth. He spoke as if the regulatory investigations were merely a misunderstanding, a minor hurdle that could be cleared with enough money and the right handshakes. As the main course was served, Mark leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Let's stop the pleasantries, Arthur. You've made your point. You've rattled my cage. Now tell me what it will take for Sarah Vance to stop her crusade against my subsidiaries. I'm prepared to offer a partnership, a seat on the board of the Sterling Group, wealth that your current salary can't even touch." He looked at Sarah, expecting to see greed or hesitation. Instead, he saw a wall of ice. "You think everything has a price, don't you, Mark?" Sarah said, using his first name for the first time. The intimacy of it startled him. "In this world, yes," Mark replied. "Everyone wants something. What is it you want? A legacy, power, a number with enough zeros to make you forget where you came from?" Sarah leaned in, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. "I want you to remember a night about a year ago," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Mark frowned, his brow furrowing. "I'm a busy man, Sarah. I don't dwell on the past." Sarah smiled, but it was a sharp, jagged expression. "A rainy night, a woman on a doorstep, a man who walked away because she was a complication. Do you remember her, Mark? Or was she just part of the dead wood you pruned?" The color drained from Mark's face so quickly, it was as if a ghost had walked through him. He looked at her, really looked at her. Beyond the expensive suit and the professional veneer, he saw the shape of her eyes, the tilt of her chin. The silence in the room became deafening. Arthur Montgomery watched the exchange, his eyes darting between them, realizing for the first time that there was a history here he hadn't been told. Mark's hands began to tremble, slightly, a movement he tried to hide by gripping his wine glass. "Sarah," he breathed, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. It can't be." "It is," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The woman you left in the mud didn't die. She grew up. She learned your games. And then she played them better than you." Mark tried to regain his footing, his arrogance fighting through the shock. "So, this is what this is? A revenge plot? You think because you found some accounting errors that you can take me down? I have lawyers, Sarah. I have resources you can't fathom. You're still just a waitress playing dress-up." He stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "Get out, both of you! The deal is off. I'll crush you by morning." Sarah didn't move. She simply took a small flash drive from her purse and set it on the table. "You're right, Mark. You have resources. But I have the Aegis master files, the ones you thought were deleted, the ones that show you didn't just manipulate the market. You laundered money for entities the government has been tracking for years. If I leave this room without a signed confession and a full transfer of your controlling interest in the shipping division, this data goes to the Department of Justice. And unlike before, you won't be able to buy your way out of a federal prison." The silence that followed Sarah's ultimatum was heavy, suffocating the air out of the grand dining room. Mark stood frozen, his eyes darting to the small silver flash drive as if it were a coiled viper. The Aegis files were his greatest secret, a digital trail of every unethical shortcut and shadow deal he had authorized to maintain his empire's dominance. He had spent millions to ensure those files were scrubbed from existence. To see them sitting there, between a half-eaten steak and a glass of expensive Bordeaux, shattered his reality. "You're bluffing," Mark hissed, though his voice lacked conviction. "No one could have recovered those. The servers were wiped. The hardware was physically destroyed." Sarah leaned back, her composure a sharp contrast to his unraveling state. "You forgot one thing, Mark. You used to leave your encrypted laptop open while you thought I was asleep in that tiny apartment. You thought I was just a simple girl who didn't understand the lines of code on your screen. But I watched. I learned your passwords. I saw the patterns. I made a backup long before you ever decided to walk out that door." Arthur Montgomery sat in stunned silence, realizing that Sarah Vance, the woman he had mentored, wasn't just a brilliant strategist. She was a woman who had been forged in the fires of a billionaire's betrayal. He looked at Mark with a mixture of disgust and pity. The titan of industry was shrinking before their eyes. Mark's lawyer, Elias, who had been waiting in the hallway, burst in after hearing the raised voices. He took one look at Mark's face and the flash drive on the table, and knew the tide had turned. "Mark, don't say another word," Elias cautioned, but it was too late. Mark turned on his lawyer, his face purple with rage. "You told me she was nobody. You told me the records were gone." He turned back to Sarah, his hands grasping at the edge of the table. "What do you want, Sarah? Money? Fine. Name your price. 10 million, 50. I'll give you enough to live like a queen for the rest of your life. Just give me that drive and walk away. We can forget this ever happened." Sarah felt a cold wave of satisfaction. "You still don't get it, do you? I don't want your money. I already have a career, a home, and a future that I built without a single cent of your blood money. I want the one thing you value most. I want your legacy. I want the Sterling Group shipping division, the foundation of your family's power. I want you to sign it over to a trust that will be managed by the Montgomery firm, with me as the primary shareholder." Mark let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "You're insane. That's my birthright. I'll never give it to a waitress." Sarah stood up, the movement slow and graceful. She picked up the flash drive. "Then I suppose the federal agents waiting for my signal will be very interested in your birthright. They'll seize it anyway, once you're behind bars. The difference is, if you sign it over now, you might stay out of a cage. If you don't, you'll lose the company and your freedom." She began to walk toward the door, her heels echoing like a death knell. "Wait!" Mark shouted, the word echoing off the glass walls. He slumped into his chair, the weight of his defeat finally breaking him. He looked at the vast, empty opulence of his home and realized it was built on a foundation of sand. The woman he had treated as a disposable object was now holding the deed to his life. "If I sign, you'll destroy the files." Sarah stopped and turned. "I'll give them to Arthur. As long as you retire and never attempt to enter the business world again, they stay in his vault. One move against us and the DOJ gets a very special delivery." Elias quickly pulled out a tablet, his fingers flying as he drafted the emergency transfer documents. The air in the room was thick with the smell of defeat. Mark signed the digital documents with a shaking hand, his signature, once a symbol of absolute power, now a mark of his surrender. As the final confirmation beeped on the screen, Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The man who had left her to die was now a ghost in his own house. As they walked out to the car, Arthur looked at Sarah with a new sense of awe. "You had those files all along?" he asked. Sarah looked out at the dark ocean waves crashing against the cliffs. "I had pieces of them, Arthur. The rest was a calculation. I knew his ego would fill in the blanks. He was so afraid of his own secrets that he didn't realize I was holding a mirror to his soul." Arthur shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "You're more dangerous than I thought, Sarah Vance." "I'm not dangerous, Arthur," she replied softly, thinking of the little girl waiting for her at home. "I'm just a mother who had to find a way to protect her child." As the car drove away from the glass palace, Sarah didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was finally where it belonged, buried under the weight of her success. But the world was about to find out that the Sterling Group had a new owner, and she was far more formidable than the man she replaced. The news of the sudden leadership change at the Sterling Group hit the financial world like a seismic event. By the next morning, headlines across every major network were screaming about the Vance takeover. Mark Sterling had officially stepped down, citing health reasons and a desire for a quiet retirement. But the street knew better. The stock price fluctuated wildly, until Arthur Montgomery held a press conference, announcing that the Montgomery firm would be stabilizing the shipping division under the direction of their most brilliant mind, Sarah Vance. For the first time in her life, Sarah was not hiding. She stood before the cameras, her face a mask of professional calm, hiding the storm of emotions swirling within. Deep inside the Sterling Group headquarters, a building she now partially owned, Sarah walked through the glass-walled corridors. Employees whispered as she passed. They saw a powerful executive, a vulture who had snatched a kingdom. None of them saw the woman who had spent nights crying in a cold suburban house because she couldn't afford a heater. She entered Mark's former office, a room that smelled of expensive cigars and cold ambition. She immediately called for the maintenance crew. "Strip the wallpaper," she ordered, "but change the furniture. I want every trace of the previous occupant removed by Monday." She wasn't just taking over. She was exorcising a demon. Despite her professional victory, the personal battle was entering a new, more dangerous phase. Mark Sterling might have been defeated in the boardroom, but a man with his level of narcissism doesn't disappear quietly. He moved to a secluded villa in the south, but his lawyers remained active. Sarah began to receive strange phone calls. Silence on the other end followed by the sound of rain. She knew it was him. It was a psychological game, a reminder that he was still out there, watching her. He had realized that the poor waitress had outsmarted him and the humiliation was eating him alive. He wasn't after his company anymore. He was after her peace of mind. Sarah tightened her security. She moved into a high-security penthouse and hired a team to watch Hope 24 hours a day. Her life became a series of controlled movements between armored cars and secure floors. The wealth she had gained was a shield, but it was also a cage. One afternoon, Arthur Montgomery visited her in her new office. He looked worried. "Sarah, you've achieved the impossible," he said, sitting across from her. "But you're living like a fugitive. Mark is broken, but his ego is still alive. There are rumors he's trying to track down the hospital records from that night, the night your daughter was born." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If Mark found out about Hope, everything would change. Currently, he believed she had targeted him purely out of revenge for the way he treated her. He didn't know he had a child. In his mind, Sarah was just a woman he had used and discarded. If he realized he had an heir, a Sterling by blood, he would use the child as a pawn to regain his leverage. He would fight for custody just to spite her. Or worse, use the girl to get back into the company. "He won't find anything," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "I had those records sealed and encrypted months ago." "Records can be unsealed by the right judge or the right amount of money," Arthur warned. "You need to finish this. You need to ensure he can never come near you or your family again." Sarah knew he was right. She had the Aegis files, but she had promised not to use them unless Mark moved against the company. She realized now that she had been too merciful. She had left him with his freedom and a portion of his wealth, hoping he would just fade away. But a man like Mark doesn't fade. He rots, and the rot spreads. She needed to find a way to neutralize him permanently, without violating her own deal or the law. She began to dig into Mark's retirement activities. She discovered he was spending his time with a group of offshore investors, men who operated in the gray areas of international law. He was trying to build a new empire, one that wouldn't be subject to the regulations of the Sterling Group. He was using the money he had left to fund a shadow fleet of shipping vessels, essentially becoming a competitor to his old firm. He was trying to prove he didn't need the Sterling name to be a god. Sarah watched his movements through a private investigator, waiting for him to make a mistake. She didn't have to wait long. Mark, in his desperation to reclaim his status, began to cut corners even more aggressively than before. He was bypassing safety protocols and bribing port officials in developing nations. He was becoming reckless, driven by a singular obsession to crush Sarah Vance. Sarah realized that she didn't need to attack him. She just had to let him destroy himself. She began to subtly leak information to his new partners about his instability. She planted seeds of doubt, making them believe that Mark Sterling was a cursed man who brought the eyes of the law wherever he went. Slowly, the shadow investors began to pull back, leaving Mark isolated once again. Mark's descent was rapid, fueled by a toxic mixture of desperation and his own unshakable pride. Left alone in his Mediterranean villa, he watched his new shadow fleet stall in international waters as port after port denied them entry. The sterling touch was gone, replaced by a reputation for being a liability. But while his business ventures crumbled, his obsession with Sarah reached a fever pitch. He spent his nights obsessing over the timeline of their separation. He remembered the rain, the mud, and the look in Sarah's eyes. Not just the anger, but a protective ferocity he hadn't understood at the time. The breakthrough he was looking for came from a disgraced former clerk at the county hospital who was desperate for a payout. For $50,000, the clerk provided a grainy cell phone photo of a paper log that had escaped the digital purge. It was a simple entry: Sarah Doe, patient 402, emergency C-section, infant female. The date was the day after Mark had driven away from their suburban home. Mark stared at the image for hours, the realization sinking in like a lead weight. He didn't just have an enemy in the city, he had a daughter who was the legitimate heir to the Sterling name and, more importantly, a potential legal bridge back into the empire he had lost. Sarah was in the middle of a board meeting when her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown number. It was a photo of the hospital log. No text, just the image. Her heart stopped, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. She excused herself, her legs feeling like lead as she walked to her private office. She knew the game had changed. Mark didn't want a truce, and he didn't want her money anymore. He wanted the one thing she loved most. He was going to use hope to tear her world down. Within an hour, Sarah had mobilized her entire security team. "I want the penthouse locked down. No one goes in or out without my personal authorization," she commanded. She called Arthur, her voice shaking for the first time in years. "He knows, Arthur. He found out about the baby." Arthur's response was immediate and grim. "He's going to file for a paternity test and use it to claim a seat on the board of the trust. He'll argue that you hid his child to defraud him of his parental rights and his company. In the eyes of a conservative judge, it could work." Sarah felt a surge of cold, focused fury. She had spent a year playing by the rules of corporate warfare, but Mark had just crossed into her heart. She realized that as long as Mark Sterling had a platform, he would never stop. She looked at the Aegis files on her secure server. She had promised to keep them in the vault as long as he stayed retired. But Mark hadn't stayed retired. He had engaged in international bribery and was now attempting to use a child as a legal weapon. The deal was officially dead. She didn't wait for him to file his papers. She went on the offensive. She leaked the second half of the Aegis files, the part containing the names of the international entities he had laundered money for. Not to the DOJ, but to the entities themselves. These were dangerous men who valued discretion above all else. By showing them that Mark had kept a black book of their transactions, Sarah turned Mark's former allies into his most terrifying enemies. At the same time, she sent the full dossier to the International Maritime Bureau, detailing the safety violations of his shadow fleet. Mark was sitting in a cafe in Monaco, drafting a letter to his lawyers about parental rights, when he noticed he was being followed. It wasn't the police. It was a group of men in dark suits who didn't look like they cared about due process. Panic, real and visceral, gripped him. He realized that Sarah hadn't just attacked his bank account. She had stripped away his protection. He was no longer the powerful billionaire. He was a man who knew too much and had no one left to pay for his safety. He tried to call Elias, but his lawyer's number had been disconnected. He tried to access his offshore accounts, only to find them frozen by a sudden regulatory injunction. He was a man without a country, a man without a name, and a man without a friend. He fled the cafe, leaving behind his expensive watch to pay the bill. He spent the night hiding in a crowded train station, the very picture of the commoner he had once pretended to be. But this time, it wasn't a social experiment. It was his life. He looked at his reflection in a dirty window and saw the man Sarah had been married to, the man who had nothing. He realized then that Sarah hadn't just taken his company. She had forced him to live the life he had once mocked. Mark Sterling spent 48 hours in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. The men following him were shadows in the peripheral of his vision, reminders of the dangerous people he had once thought he could control with money. He was learning in the harshest way possible that in the world of true power, money is only as good as the loyalty it buys. And Mark had no loyalty. He had spent his life treating people like disposable assets, and now he was the most disposable asset of all. He eventually found himself at a local police station in a small coastal town, not to turn himself in for his crimes, but to beg for protective custody. But even the law had no interest in protecting a man whose assets had been frozen and whose reputation was radioactive. The local authorities, tipped off by an anonymous source, Sarah's team, processed him for questioning regarding his shadow fleet's maritime violations. As he sat in a cold, dimly lit interview room, a far cry from the velvet-lined chairs of his penthouse, a man walked in. It wasn't a police officer, it was a process server. He placed a thick stack of papers on the table in front of Mark. "You've been served, Mr. Sterling," the man said with a mechanical indifference. Mark looked down at the documents. It wasn't a paternity suit. It was a comprehensive restraining order and a petition for the total termination of his parental rights, citing his involvement in international criminal activities and his history of abandonment. Attached to the petition was a sworn affidavit from the doctor who had saved Sarah's life, detailing the physical and emotional trauma she had suffered because Mark had refused to take her to the hospital. There was also a transcript of the conversation they had held at the Glass Palace, where Mark had referred to his own child's mother as dead wood. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah hadn't just built a case, she had built a fortress. She had anticipated every move he would make. He realized that by trying to find hope, he had provided the final piece of evidence she needed to prove he was a threat to the child's safety. He looked at the papers and felt a crushing sense of finality. He had nothing to fight with. His lawyers were gone, his money was gone, and the Sterling name was now synonymous with fraud and cruelty. He slumped over the table, the weight of his own choices finally breaking his spirit. Back in the city, Sarah sat in the nursery, watching Hope sleep. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical world of the Sterling group. She held a glass of water, her hands perfectly still. The news had just broken that the Shadow Fleet had been seized, and that Mark Sterling was being held for questioning by international authorities. The threat was neutralized, not because she had killed him, but because she had shown the world exactly who he was. She had stripped away the billionaire's mask to reveal the hollow man beneath. Arthur Montgomery joined her on the balcony of the penthouse later that night. The city lights sparkled below them, like a carpet of diamonds. "It's over, Sarah," he said softly. "The board has officially confirmed your position as chairperson. The Sterling name is being phased out. From tomorrow, it will be the Vance Montgomery Group." Sarah looked out at the horizon. She had achieved everything she had set out to do. She was one of the most powerful women in the country. She had secured her daughter's future. But more importantly, she had reclaimed her own dignity. I thought I would feel more triumphant, Sarah admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur nodded understandingly. Revenge is a hollow meal, Sarah. But this wasn't just revenge. This was justice. You didn't just take his company, you saved it from a man who would have burned it down for an extra percentage point of profit. You've given thousands of employees a stable future. And you've given your daughter a mother who is a hero, not a victim. Sarah looked at him and smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She realized that her journey wasn't about the billions or the power. It was about the moment she stood up in the rain and decided to keep walking. The poor wife was gone. But so was the cold strategist she had to become to survive. She was ready to be something new. She was ready to be Sarah, a mother, a leader, and a woman who knew her own worth. As she watched the sun rise over the city, she knew that the hardest part of her life was behind her. She had built an empire from the mud, and she was going to rule it with the heart that Mark Sterling never had. The transition from the Sterling Group to the Vance Montgomery Group was more than just a rebranding. It was a revolution. Under Sarah's leadership, the company's culture shifted from a cutthroat, profit-at-all-costs machine to a global leader in ethical shipping and sustainable technology. Sarah implemented industry-leading maternal leave policies and established a massive foundation to provide medical care for women in underserved communities. The very kind of help she had been denied on that fateful rainy night. She became the face of a new generation of business leaders, one who understood that true power is measured by the lives you uplift, not the people you crush. Mark Sterling's name eventually faded from the headlines, relegated to a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Stripped of his wealth and banned from the corporate world, he disappeared into a quiet, lonely life of obscurity. He was a man who had everything and realized too late that he had nothing because he lacked the capacity to love. He lived with the knowledge that his daughter was growing up in a world where she was loved and protected, but he would never be part of it. He was the ghost of a billionaire, haunted by the memory of a woman he had underestimated and a child he had never known. As for Sarah, she remained a private person despite her public role. She never married again, choosing instead to focus her heart on Hope and the empire she had built. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, Sarah took her back to that small, dilapidated house in the suburbs. It wasn't to dwell on the pain, but to show her daughter where they had come from. The house was gone, replaced by a community park Sarah had funded. Sarah stood on the spot where she had once begged for mercy and looked at her daughter, who was playing in the grass, vibrant and free. She realized then that the poor wife had finally found her peace. She wasn't defined by the betrayal of a billionaire, but by the strength of her own spirit. She had turned her greatest tragedy into her greatest triumph. As the sun set over the park, casting long golden shadows, Sarah took Hope's hand. They walked toward their car, not a symbol of status, but a vessel for their journey. Sarah looked back one last time and whispered a silent thank you to the woman she used to be. The rain had long since stopped, and the future was brighter than any diamond Mark Sterling could have ever bought. Sarah's story became a beacon for anyone who felt abandoned or forgotten. It proved that your current circumstances are not your final destination. It showed that even when you are at your lowest, buried in the mud of someone else's cruelty, you have the seed of greatness within you. You just have to be brave enough to grow. Sarah Vance started as a woman with nothing, and she ended as a woman who had everything that truly mattered. Her dignity, her daughter, and a legacy that would last for generations. The billionaire was gone, but the mother had conquered the world. And that is the incredible story of how a woman's greatest heartbreak became the foundation of an unstoppable empire. It's a reminder that no matter how dark the storm, you have the power to write your own ending. Thank you so much for watching this journey of betrayal, strength, and ultimate justice. If Sarah's story inspired you or moved you today, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more of these powerful, life-changing stories to you every single week. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. What did you think of Sarah's revenge? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay strong and keep believing in your own power.